Why does this parable bother religious people so much? Introduction. Have you ever stopped to think about why some of Jesus' teachings are so bothersome? I'm not talking about those messages about love and forgiveness that everyone applauds and shares on social media. I'm talking about the parables that pierce the soul, that shake structures, that expose truths many people prefer to keep hidden. There's one specific parable that 2,000 years ago caused an earthquake in the religious community. And look, it's still causing one today. The problem isn't that it's hard to understand. The problem is that it's too easy to understand, and that's exactly why it bothers people. Because this parable doesn't confront the sinners on the street corner, those far from faith, those who admit their mistakes. No, it confronts those who think they're already right with God. It confronts those who pray, who fast, who know the Bible inside and out, who attend temple religiously. It confronts people like me, and perhaps like you, here. As a truth few have the courage to say. It's possible to be completely wrong spiritually while doing everything right religiously. Sounds contradictory. Well, that's exactly what Jesus taught in this explosive parable. You can have an agenda packed with church commitments. You can post verses every day. You can have an impeccable reputation in Christian circles and still be completely off God's radar of approval. Scary, isn't it? But wait, it gets better or worse, depending on how you see it. Jesus took the best example of religiosity of the time and placed it side by side with the worst example of public sin. An impeccable Pharisee versus a corrupt tax collector. And when he revealed which of the two was accepted by God, the ground shook beneath everyone's feet who thought they had the spiritual formula figured out. When God speaks to the heart, he doesn't follow the logic that religion taught us. And maybe that's exactly why you need to hear this message today. You know what's most intriguing? Most people who read this parable immediately identify with the tax collector, the repentant sinner, the broken one, the humble one. But really, or could it be that, deep down, without realizing it, we act much more like the Pharisee than we'd like to admit? Have you never looked at someone who fell and thought, "Thank God I am not like that"? Have you never felt a touch of spiritual superiority when you see people drifting away from church while you remain firm? Have your prayers never turned into a list of achievements instead of a cry for mercy? Because here's the real deal. This parable wasn't told to make you feel comfortable. It was told to shake you, to make you question whether your faith is built on the right foundation. God saw your pain, but he also sees the pride hidden in the folds of your religiosity. You're not alone. God is with you. But the question is, do you really want his presence or just his approval based on what you do? Today, you're going to dive into one of the most dangerous and transformative messages Jesus ever told. Dangerous because it has the power to dismantle years of religious conditioning. Transformative because, if you let it, it will completely change how you relate to God and the people around you. You'll understand why religious practices don't guarantee divine approval, why spiritual pride is more deadly than sin itself, and why God prefers to hear a broken heart over an impeccable spiritual resume. This isn't a theoretical message for you to file away in your mind. It's an urgent call for you to evaluate which side of the parable you're really on. Because in the end, the question isn't how much you know about God, but how much you recognize that you need Him. God heard your prayer, but was it a prayer of dependence or self-sufficiency in disguise? When everything seemed lost, was it grace that reached you or your merits that saved you? Tears that God sees are worth more than applause that men give. And if you're ready to have your concepts challenged, to leave the religious comfort zone and discover what it really means to have faith in Jesus Christ, then take a deep breath, because this journey is about to begin now. Biblical and historical context. You know, there's something fascinating when we stop to understand the scenario where Jesus told his stories. It wasn't just a bunch of people sitting passively listening. No, it was real people with real prejudices, with well-defined social hierarchies, and with a religiosity that often suffocated more than it liberated. When Jesus decides to tell this specific parable, he already knew exactly who was going to be bothered. And look, it wasn't the sinners on the street corner. No, it was precisely those who sat in the best places in the synagogue, who knew the law by heart, who fasted pompously, and who made sure everyone saw their long and elaborate prayers. The target of this message was clear as water. People who trusted in themselves, who thought they had already earned divine favoritism through their own religious performance. And that, my friend, is way too dangerous. Because when we think we've already arrived, that's exactly when we stop walking. God sustained me in moments when I also thought I knew everything, and I can tell you, the fall from the pedestal hurts, but it's necessary. Now, let's talk about the Pharisees, because understanding who these guys were completely changes how you see the parable. They weren't movie villains. You know, they were extremely dedicated men, deep scholars of the scriptures, people who woke up early to pray, who fasted twice a week, not because the law commanded it, but because they wanted to go beyond. They tithed even the herbs from their garden, such was their rigor. To the society of that time, they were true heroes of faith. Examples to be followed. Jewish mothers dreamed that their sons would become Pharisees. But here is the problem that Jesus saw and that many people today still can't see. When you spend your whole life building an impeccable spiritual reputation, there comes a moment when you start trusting more in your reputation than in God. Faith in Jesus Christ transforms into a checklist, into a resume you present as if you were in a heavenly job interview. And then, without realizing it, you trade relationship for religiosity, intimacy for performance. On the other side of the coin were the tax collectors and man. If you wanted to choose someone to be hated by everyone, it was these people. They collected taxes for the Roman Empire, meaning they worked for the enemy, for the oppressor. But it wasn't just that. No, they usually overcharged, pocketing the difference, which made them figures associated with betrayal, corruption, and greed. For a religious Jew, sitting at the same table as a tax collector was unthinkable. You would become impure, contaminated. They were excluded from synagogues, rejected at parties, avoided on the streets. If there were a list of people God would never forgive, tax collectors would be at the top, at least in the minds of the religious folks of that time. So imagine the shock when Jesus puts precisely a tax collector as an example of a prayer accepted by God. This wasn't just controversial, it was revolutionary. It was a bomb thrown into the middle of comfortable religiosity. You're not alone. God is with you, even when the whole society rejects you and points its finger at you. And it's exactly in this absurd contrast that Jesus builds the most uncomfortable parable in history. He takes the best and the worst of religious society and places them side by side in the temple, in the most sacred place that existed. One enters confidently, full of merits, with the clear conscience of someone who has fulfilled all duties. The other can barely lift his eyes, crushed by the weight of his own shame and guilt. And the big twist, the plot twist no one expected, is that the one who left justified wasn't the one with the impeccable resume, but the one with the broken heart. When God speaks to the heart, He's not looking for external perfection, He's looking for internal truth. He's not impressed by how many times you fasted or how much you donated, but by how much you recognize that without Him, you are nothing. And this message crosses centuries because even today we live in a world where appearance is worth more than essence, where how holy you seem is worth more than how much you really depend on grace. The parable told two men go up to the temple, and right away you can feel the difference in the air. The first enters like someone who's at home, like someone who knows every corner of that sacred place, every ritual, every prayer time. His posture is firm, his gaze is direct, there's no hesitation in his steps. He's a Pharisee, and everyone knows it, the clothes, the way he walks. Those phylacteries on his forehead that showed how dedicated he was to the law. When he opens his mouth to pray, it's not a timid plea, no. It's almost a presentation, a report of spiritual achievements. God, I thank you because I am not like other men, robbers, evildoers, or even like this tax collector. Notice what happens here. He starts talking to God, but quickly the conversation becomes a monologue about himself. His prayer isn't an encounter, it's self-promotion disguised as gratitude. God saw your pain, but did this man ever allow God to see his? Or was he too busy polishing his own image? And then he continues, detailing his spiritual accomplishments like someone listing medals on a wall. I fast twice a week. I give tithes of all that I get. Now, pay attention to something important. None of this is wrong, okay? Fasting is good. Tithing is biblical. Following the law is necessary. The problem isn't in what he does, but in how he sees himself because of what he does. He transformed obedience into currency, as if God were a bank manager who's impressed with regular deposits. His faith became mathematics. I do X, Y, and Z, therefore I deserve approval. And look, This is extremely dangerous because we fall into this trap with absurd ease. How many times have you thought, man, I pray every day, read the Bible, help at church, why does it seem like God doesn't hear me? When everything seemed lost in your spiritual walk, maybe the problem wasn't God being deaf, but you speaking the wrong language, the language of merit, not grace. Now the scene changes completely, and it's as if the air in the temple becomes heavier. The second man enters, and everything about him screams discomfort. He doesn't approach the altar as the Pharisee did. He stays there, far away, leaning against a column, trying to occupy the smallest space possible, as if he didn't deserve to be there. And man, in his mind, he really didn't deserve it. This is the tax collector. The tax collector, the traitor, the one everyone looked at with disgust and contempt. He doesn't lift his eyes to heaven because the shame weighs too much. He doesn't open his arms in worship because he knows his hands are dirty. The only thing he can do is beat his chest in a gesture of anguish and true repentance, and let escape one of the shortest and most powerful prayers ever recorded. God, have mercy on me, a sinner. 7 words. No embellishment, no justification, no comparison with anyone. Just raw truth and sincere desperation. Tears that God sees even when no one else cares. And then comes the shock, the twist no one expected, the phrase that made everyone's jaw drop. Jesus looks at the crowd and says, I tell you, this man, rather than the other, went home justified before God. Wait, what? The corrupt one was accepted and the religious one was rejected. The public sinner left forgiven, and the man of prayer left empty. Exactly. And Jesus doesn't stop there. He nails the lesson with a phrase that crosses generations. For everyone who exalts himself will be humbled, and he who humbles himself will be exalted. This parable isn't about who sins more or less. It's about who recognizes they need God. Heaven is silent, but God is acting, and often he acts in ways that completely confront our religious logic. God heard your prayer, but was it a prayer of dependence or independence in disguise? Are you asking for mercy or presenting arguments for why you deserve to be heard? Because in the end, it's not about what you did, but about whom you trust. Why does this parable bother religious people so much? The first reason this parable causes so much discomfort is simple and direct. It destroys the idea that religious practices guarantee divine approval. And look, this bothers a lot of people because we've been conditioned to believe that spirituality works like a point system. You pray, you earn points. You fast, even more points. You tithe, go to services, participate in volunteer work. Done. Your heavenly account is full. You're good with God. But then Jesus comes and throws a bucket of cold water on all this logic. The Pharisee did everything right, followed the manual to the letter, had a clean record that would make any religious leader drool with envy. And even so, he left the temple the same way he entered, not justified, not transformed. God acts in silence. But he doesn't always act the way our religiosity expects. When God speaks to the heart, He's not interested in your history of spiritual activities. He wants to know if you're genuinely open to Him or just following protocol. Think with me. How many people do you know who do everything right at church, but in reality live embittered, critical, full of judgment? They pray every day, but prayer has become mechanical routine. They read the Bible, but reading has become religious obligation, not transformative encounter. They participate in everything, but participate more to be seen than to truly serve. And the worst thing is that often they don't even realize their faith has become a checklist, a religion of appearances. A practical example. Imagine someone who never misses a service, always in the front row, raises their hands during worship, but on Monday treats employees with contempt, gossips about brothers and sisters, holds grudges and resentment. This person can have all religious practices aligned, but the heart is completely misaligned with God. You're not alone. God is with you, but He's not impressed with your religious performance if it doesn't spring from a transformed heart. The parable bothers because it exposes this hypocrisy that we prefer not to see. The second reason for discomfort is even deeper and more painful. This parable reveals that spiritual pride distances us from God more than sin itself. Let that marinate in your head for a second. The tax collector was a confessed sinner, an admitted corrupt, someone who was objectively wrong in many areas of life, but he was justified. Why? Because he didn't have pride. He had awareness. The Pharisee, despite all his external righteousness, carried something much more dangerous inside his chest. The certainty that he didn't need mercy because he had already earned the right to be accepted. I am not like other men, he said, and in this seemingly innocent phrase lives the deadly poison of spiritual pride. He wasn't comparing himself with God, with divine holiness, with the perfection of the Creator's character. No, he was comparing himself with other people. And when you do that, when your measuring stick is horizontal and not vertical, you'll always think you're better than someone. God sustained me when I thought I was better than others, and He taught me that while I looked to the side, I would never truly look up. And man, this is so current, it's scary. We live in an era where social media has amplified this problem to the extreme. Everyone posting verses, stories from services, photos of prayer, vigils, fasting, hashtags, and I'm not saying this is wrong. It's not. The problem is when it becomes a showcase, when it becomes a way of saying, look how dedicated I am, look how holy I am, look how I'm not like so-and-so who fell into sin. Spiritual pride is sneaky because it disguises itself as zeal, as holiness, as love for truth. But deep down, it's pure arrogance. It's that person who sees someone stumble and thinks, I would never do that. Thank God I'm stronger. It's that believer who criticizes those who are away from church but doesn't lift a finger to help. Tears that God sees are those of the fallen, the broken, those who recognize their fragility. And often He ignores the eloquent and elaborate prayers of those who think they read to righteous, to need to cry at His feet. Faith in Jesus Christ isn't about thinking you're better. It's about recognizing that without Him, you are nothing. The third reason this parable bothers so much is because it shows in crystal clear fashion that God hears brokenness, not spiritual resentment. And this goes against everything religious logic has taught us. We think we need to come before God with something in our hands, with something to offer, with some argument that justifies why we deserve to be heard. But the tax collector had none of that. He didn't present his works because he had no worthy works. He didn't speak of his fasts because he probably didn't fast. He didn't mention his previous prayers because maybe he didn't even pray frequently. All he had was awareness of his real state and a desperate hope in divine mercy. God, have mercy on me, a sinner, period. No beating around the bush, no justifications, no trying to paint the situation a different color. When everything seemed lost for him, when everyone had already written him off as a lost cause, he did the only thing that mattered. He threw himself on grace, and God responded. God heard your prayer, even if it was short, even if it was ashamed, even if it had no religious eloquence, because God resists the proud, but draws near to the broken. Deep application for today. This parable Jesus told over 2,000 years ago isn't a museum relic. You know, it's alive, pulsating, happening now, at this exact moment, in churches, in prayer groups, in hearts that call themselves Christians, but, without realizing it, repeat the same mistake as the Pharisee. We live in a generation obsessed with authenticity on social media, but that often lives a completely fake faith in real life. You post the verse, but don't live the verse. You sing about humility, but judge those who fell. You talk about love, but cultivate resentment against those who hurt you. And the scariest thing is that we manage to do all this while maintaining an impeccable religious routine, guaranteed presence at services, tithes up to date, participation in ministries. But when God speaks to the heart, He's not looking at your schedule full of religious commitments. He's looking at the real condition of your soul. God saw your pain, but He also sees your hypocrisy. He sees when you pray with your mouth but keep your heart closed. He sees when you point out others' sins while hiding yours under the carpet of religiosity. Let's be practical here, because theory without application doesn't transform anyone. This parable manifests today when you see someone who fell into sin and your first reaction is antipathy, but judgment. When you think, I would never do that, I'm firmer, I have more character, or when someone shares a struggle, a pain, a temptation, and you respond with cold verses instead of embracing with compassion. You know that brother or sister who drifted away from church. Instead of trying to understand what happened, you already labeled them. Weak in faith, didn't persevere, was never truly converted. This is the Pharisees' mentality disguised as spiritual zeal. A real example. Imagine a young woman who got pregnant out of wedlock. She enters the church pregnant, ashamed, broken, exactly like the tax collector, unable to lift her eyes. And instead of finding mercy, she finds condemning looks, whispers, isolation. Meanwhile, there are people there hiding adultery in marriage, greed at work, pride in their hearts, but because they maintain appearances in order, they feel entitled to judge. You're not alone. God is with you, but are you willing to extend that same truth to those who erred more visibly? Religion without humility becomes judgment, and faith without mercy becomes arrogance. This phrase needs to echo in your mind because it perfectly sums up the danger Jesus was warning about. When your spirituality makes you look at others with contempt instead of compassion, something is very wrong. When you use the Bible as a weapon to wound instead of a tool to restore, you're not looking like Jesus. You're looking like the Pharisee of the parable. Think about these situations. Someone posts on social media that they're going through depression. And instead of offering genuine support, you send a pray more, read the Bible. That's lack of faith. That's religion without mercy. Or when you see someone struggling with addictions, and instead of understanding it's a real battle, you simplify with just have willpower. I would never fall into that. That's spiritual arrogance. God acts in silence, and often He's acting in that person's life in ways you can't see. Heaven is silent, but God is acting, and maybe He's trying to use you as an instrument of grace, but you're too busy building walls of judgment. So now comes the most uncomfortable part, the time to look in the mirror and ask yourself some difficult questions. First question. When you pray, do you exalt yourself or surrender yourself? Be honest. Are your prayers a list of spiritual achievements or a genuine recognition of dependence? Do you thank God for not being like those sinners, or do you place yourself in the same category of needing grace? Second question, do you compare yourself with people or place yourself before God? Because if your measuring stick is other people's failures, you'll always think you're doing well. But if your measuring stick is God's holiness, you'll realize how much you still need to grow. Third question, and this one hurts. Does your faith make you more humble or more critical? If you're becoming increasingly intolerant, increasingly hard on those who are, increasingly distant from those who struggle, something is wrong. True spiritual transformation brings you closer to people. It doesn't distance you from them. Faith in Jesus Christ should make you look at the cross and remember that you were lost too, that you were rescued by grace, not by merit. God sustained me when I was the tax collector of the story, and if I'm standing today, it's not because I'm better than anyone, but because divine mercy reached me. So, who are you in the parable? The one who prays full of himself, or the one who cries recognizing his need? Because the big question isn't how much you do for God, but who you become before Him. Conclusion. So, we've come this far, and now comes the question that really matters. What are you going to do with everything you just learned? Because look, knowledge without application is just information accumulated in your head, and information without transformation changes absolutely nothing in your life. Jesus did untell this parable for you to simply agree with your head and move on the same way. He told it to provoke an internal revolution, to shake the structures of your faith, to make you look in the mirror and ask with brutal honesty, am I the Pharisee or the tax collector? And don't come at me with that automatic answer of, oh, I'm the tax collector, of course. Because if you really were, you'd be trembling before God at this moment, not feeling comfortable with your own humility. Faith in Jesus. Christ is unte about having the right answers on the tip of your tongue. It is about having your heart open to be transformed by truth, even when it hurts, even when it exposes, even when it deconstructs the image you built of yourself. Now, answer me something. With complete sincerity, when was the last time you cried before God, recognizing that without Him, you are nothing? When was the last time you prayed without presenting arguments, without listing your spiritual achievements, without trying to prove you deserve to be heard? Or have your prayers become automatic reports full of religious formality, but empty of real intimacy? Do you have the courage to stop now, close your eyes and say, God, have mercy on me, a sinner? Or does that sound too simple, too humble, too insufficient for someone who already does so much for the work? Because that's exactly where the danger lies, when you think your faith has evolved beyond the need to cry out for mercy. You haven't evolved, you've devolved into spiritual pride. God sustained me in moments when I thought I no longer needed to be sustained, and I can guarantee you the fall is ugly. When God speaks to the heart, He's not impressed with your performance. He wants unrestricted access to your interior. So go ahead, break down those walls of self-sufficiency and throw yourself on grace again, as if it were the first time. And there's one more thing I need to challenge you with. What are you going to do with the people around you who are falling, erring, struggling? Are you going to be the Pharisee who points, judges, and distances himself? Or are you going to be someone who extends their hand, who looks with compassion, who remembers that you too have been or still are desperately needing mercy? Because this parable isn't just about your vertical relationship with God, it also says everything about your horizontal relationships with people. If this message really penetrated your heart, you won't look at those who fell with contempt anymore. You'll look with empathy, with pain, with genuine desire to help them up. You're not alone. God is with you. And if that's true in your life, then it needs to be true in how you treat those who stumble beside you. God saw your pain when no one else cared, so now go see others' pain with the same eyes of mercy. Tears that God sees aren't just yours, they're everyone's who is broken and needing grace, not judgment. Look, I'm going to be direct with you. Your life is about to change, or you're going to close this video and continue exactly the same way. The choice is yours. But know that you can no longer use the excuse of ignorance. You can no longer say you didn't know that religiosity without humility distances you from God. You can no longer hide behind spiritual practices while cultivating pride in your heart. God heard your prayer now while you watched this message, and He's waiting for a response. Not a verbal response, but a life response. But when everything seemed lost in many people's walk, it was grace that rescued, not the religious resume. Connect with people, not just your resume. Focus on you, not others. Stop trusting in yourself and start trusting in Him for real. God might be silent, but He's definitely at work, often shaking up our comfy beliefs to remind us of our need for grace. And before you leave here, I want to make you an invitation. If you want to continue learning about the deep teachings of Jesus, about the parables that transform lives, about biblical truths that religiosity often hides, then subscribe to the channel now and activate the notification bell. Each week, we're going to really dig into the scriptures, not just skimming the surface, but exploring in a way that transforms how you see God, yourself, and the world around you. It's not about accumulating theological knowledge. It's about being transformed by the living Word. So click down there. Subscribe, activate notifications, and come along on this journey of discovery and transformation. Oh, and if this message touched your heart, if it bothered you in the good sense, if you felt that God spoke something specific to you, leave in the comments, "May I decrease, and He increase." I want to see how many of you are really willing to leave the Pharisee-s position and assume the tax collector-s posture. God acts in the silence of your decision at this moment. What are you going to do with all this?